So on the next few slides, I am looking to make a specific comparison between one Greek myth, that of Heracles and Deianira and Nessos, and the myth of Rama and Sita and Ravana. And the title of this slide is that Heracles fights centaurs and Rama fights the Rakshasa demons, who are very similar in many ways to the night stalkers of European folklore. And so on this graphic here, we see the Caeretan hydria number 17, and on the left you have Heracles with a bow and a club about to attack Nessos, the centaur, who has Deianira in his grasp, or is trying to take her away through another abduction. So as I said on the previous slide, I am trying to detect the similarities between Greek and Indian myths of abduction or rape, using these specific two myths as a case study. The Greek myth of Heracles, Nessos, and Deianira versus the Indian myth of Rama versus Ravana and Maricha, along with his wife Sita. So Deianira is the wife of Heracles, and she's being abducted by Nessos, whereas Sita, the wife of Rama, is being abducted by the demon Ravana. In literature, the first point that I want to make is that in literature, Heracles always deals the fatal blow to the centaur Nessos with bow and arrows. And Rama always kills Maricha, and later Ravana as well, with his bow and arrows. The Italian author Bonato observes that Heracles is always armed with a bow on the Caeretan hydria. So on the Caeretan hydria, you always see Heracles armed with a bow. And similarly, Rama is the perfect analog, for Heracles, because he's always got the bow in his hand as well. The bow is a prominent weapon for both of these heroes, as well as Apollo. Now, the next point is that when we look at the demons, Nessos the centaur is depicted unarmed on all three Caeretan hydriae, and Maricha the deer is also unarmed, of course, in his golden deer form. And like the demons Tityos and Nessos, he contorts his animal body to look back at his assailants. And you can see in the previous slide, Nessos also looking back at Heracles while he's trying to abduct his wife Deianira. Now, the last point of comparison is the most complicated. At the very moment that Rama kills him, Maricha deceives Sita with cries of "O Sita, O Lakshman" in Rama's voice, so that Lakshman himself leaves Sita alone to help Rama, and then Sita is alone and Ravana is able to abduct her. So in this situation, Maricha uses Rama's voice to fool Sita into sending Lakshman unwillingly to help protect his elder brother Rama. And that isolates her, and that's what gives Ravana an opportunity to kidnap her. So she's deceived in many ways in this episode. She's deceived by the golden deer itself and its alluring qualities, as well as these, cries at the end by Maricha that are meant to decoy Lakshman away and make Sita believe that Rama is in trouble. And also the other deception is Ravana's disguise as a mendicant, which allows him to approach Sita and then kidnap her. So she's deceived in three different ways, actually. Now, for comparison's sake, if we look at the character of Nessos, he is also about to die at the hands of Heracles by a poisoned arrow. And what he does is that he deceives Deianira in that final moment into poisoning her husband with what she thinks is a so-called love potion, but is actually the poison from the arrow. The poisoned blood from his wound. So both Nessos and Maricha are treacherous with these alluring illusions, seductive beverage, quote unquote, and seductive golden deer, respectively. So Nessos deceives Deianira and Heracles when he acts as a ferryman to help them cross a river initially, but then after that he tries to run off with Deianira and have intercourse with her. So that's the first deception, and then the second deception is at the very end when he's about to die, just like Maricha, and ends up causing Heracles' death. So both Nessos and Maricha, along with Ravana, are, deceiving the protagonists on multiple occasions. So the main difference between the two stories is really just that Ravana and Maricha are working together, whereas Nessos is acting alone. But other than that, you can see a lot of similarities between the two stories. And I just want to reiterate that the Maricha's deception of Sita, like that of the centaur Nessos, who deceived Deianira, is emphasized many times by Valmiki in the poem that he wrote of the Ramayana. The deception actually occurs in Sarga 42, near the end of Sarga 42 in the Aranyakand, or the Book of the Forest. And later on, after Rama realizes that Lakshman has been deceived, he speaks to Lakshman in the forest when they're together, away from Sita, and she's already been abducted. In Sarga 56, verses 13 to 14, he says to Lakshman, "It must have truly frightened even you when that cunning, evil Rakshas demon cried out, 'Oh, Lakshman,' at the top of his voice. I suspect Sita must have heard that voice, so like my own, and in her panic sent you off at once to find me." And I think the key word is panic here. And that's really, I think, what the artist is kind of highlighting is Sita's panic when she gets abducted by Ravana on the backside of the hydria. Now I just want to compare and contrast the narrative art styles of the Etruscan depictions of these two myths, Greek and Indian, in the Caeretan hydriae. So we're going to compare the Greek and Indian mythological characters and also contrast the narrative structure. If we notice on the number 17 hydria, the main characters of the Greek myth, Heracles, Deianira, and Nessos, are all placed together in the same scene, as is the custom in Greek art. But if we look at hydria number 2, it does not depict a complete narrative in one scene, but in 3 connected scenes, which is also the norm in Indian medieval art. And the main characters, Rama and Lakshman, are on one side, along with the golden deer Maricha. And on the other side, we have Sita and Ravana, depicted twice each, in 2 different scenes that are divided by the lotus palmette. Now, comparing the characters themselves, we see that the 2 villains, Maricha and Ravana, represent the same role as Nessos in the Greek myth. Nessos also flees like Ravana and turns toward the hero, Heracles, just like Maricha in the deer hunt as well. So in the number 17 hydria, we see Nessos fleeing as well as looking back at the assailant, Heracles, who's attacking him. And it's the same as what we see with Maricha, who's also fleeing and looking back at the 2 assailants, Rama and Lakshman. Now, Sita herself, the lady, she represents the role of Deianira, of course, and they both raise their hands against an abduction, either to get help from the hero or to resist the villain. In the case of Deianira, it seems to be to get help from Heracles, whereas in the case of Sita, it seems to be quite obviously resistance against the villain, Ravana. Now, the next point is that Rama and Lakshman are the two heroes who represent the same role as Heracles. And they're both armed with bows, all three of them. So, and the last point I want to make is that the general point I want to make is that the hydria with Heracles is meant to be viewed from left to right. That is the hydria where number 17, where it's called the punishment of Nessos. The hydria number 2 with Rama is meant to be viewed from right to left on both sides. So there is a contrast here in terms of the way the narrative is actually seen and understood. And the last point I want to make is that based on all this information, I think a good title for the theme of the Caeretan Hydria number 2 is The Golden Deer Hunt and Sita's Abduction, because both are equally important to understanding the connected narrative, or you need to know both to really understand that it's a connected narrative. So that's another title that it could be given. The facial characteristics of Ravana the satyr have been compared to many different monstrous figures in the Greek mythology, and that includes the centaurs on the Caeretan Hydria number 25, which you can see on the bottom left. And you see two different centaurs fighting Heracles. And if you look at the right graphic, the figure on the right, it is it's a comparison between several different figures, all of whom have similar facial characteristics. And so, according to the author Raffaella Bonato, who detects similar facial structures of these demons, she writes that the somatic characteristics of the liminal figures are grouped together, and they include Alcyoneus, Tityos, the satyr, which is Ravana, and the centaur that you see on number 25, or at least one of the centaurs. So, and the use of the word liminal indicates that all four characters exist on the boundary between man and animal, just like the followers or companions of Dionysus, the Seleni. We can also look at a quote from Hemmelrich on page 80 of his book. He confirms Bonato's grouping here of these four different demons when he writes, the head of Alcyoneus, which we see on number 21, is of the same family as that of the satyrs and centaurs of the hydriae, especially the nose. Now, Ravana does not only behave like the satyrs or other monstrous creatures, male creatures in Greek myth, but ironically, he also behaves very similar to the goddess Eos in her pursuit of Kephalos, in another Greek myth that was contemporary. And what I'm going to show you here are graphics that are an explicit comparison between the two abductions. These two above here are representing on the left the moment before the abduction of Kephalos by Eos, and that is from a limestone metope from Sicily in the early 5th century BC, and I believe this is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The same thing with the right-hand side here on the top. We have the abduction itself of Kephalos by Eos, who grabs his arms, if you notice. And this is from a terracotta altar from Sicily as well, in the early 5th century BC, in the ancient city of Selenus. Now, as you can see, we have on the left the moment before abduction, and then we have the abduction on the right. Now, looking below on the two scenes that we've already looked at in the Caeretan Hydria number 2, we see on the left the abduction of Sita by Ravana, who grabs her by the right arm, just like Eos grabs the arms of Kephalos on the top right. And now on this bottom right scene, we see the moment after, just after the abduction, not before, but after, with Ravana carrying Sita off. And this is from the late 6th century BC, as we have discussed, and is on the reverse side of the Caeretan hydria. So the conclusion is that Ravana is behaving like any aggressive pursuer of another, sexual desired prey or object that he is wanting and desiring very badly. So they don't have to conform to any specific look. It's more just a depiction of predator and prey, or the pursuer and the object in a sexual conquest. So if we compare the two abductions, we can also see that on the top left, Kephalos is looking back at his pursuer, Eos, just like Sita is also looking at her pursuer in Ravana by twisting her head towards him. But so you can see that on the top left and the bottom left. Now on the top right, you can see Kephalos. His feet are turned away in the opposite direction, just like Sita also has her feet turned away in the opposite direction, looking to flee, but is unable to get away because Ravana is grabbing her arm, just like Eos is grabbing Kephalos' arms. So definitely you can see the similarity in the iconography and in the structure of how they depict an abduction, no matter who the abductor is and who the object is of the abduction. So what we have here on the right is a color photo of the number 3 hydria on the reverse side. And it depicts Eos, the goddess, chasing Kephalos, who's fleeing on the left. And my topic today on this slide is to show you, at least a initial comparison with Ravana approaching Sita on the Caeretan hydria number 2. So the number 3 hydria that you see on the right, it contains a depiction of Eos, the winged goddess, and Kephalos on the reverse side. And on the front side, the main scene that you see is Apollo and Hermes and the stealing of the cattle. So Hermes is in the cradle and Apollo is questioning why his cattle have been stolen. So they seem to be totally unrelated in some ways on the surface, those two scenes. But getting back to this hydria overall, this number 3 hydria is in the same group as number 2 hydria of the so-called satyrs chasing Maenads, which is called Group A, according to Gyap Hemmelreich. And the similarities between the abduction and pursuit scenes in the number 2 and number 3 hydriae, along with the examples from Silenus in the previous slide, certainly indicate that they are both mythological scenes with named characters, meaning that the number 3 hydriae has many mythological characters that we can name, but the number 2 hydria should have the same. It should also have mythological characters that we can name, because they both have very strong similarities in terms of the abduction and pursuit. And finally, the quote from Hemmelreich I will give you is that gods are restricted to Group A, which is what number 2 and number 3 are a part of, and females are plentiful in Group A and rare in Group B. There is not a single vague scene in Group A, according to Hemmelreich, but in his opinion, the identification of Eos and Kephalos on the reverse of number 3 has sometimes been doubted. There cannot be any doubt, however, that Group A generally represents an earlier phase than Group B. So he's definitely acknowledging that Group A is an older set of vases than Group B, and that number 2 and number 3 are a part of Group A. He's also acknowledging that gods are restricted to Group A, and so therefore we should expect to find not only mythological heroes on number 2 and number 3, but also heroes that are divine. And that's what Rama is. He's a divine hero, just like Apollo or Heracles. And he also admits that females are plentiful in Group A. So clearly, if we can name Eos or Maia, the mother of Hermes or Apollo, on the front side of the number 3, then we can also name Sita on the number 2 hydria. So now I just want to make a comparison systematically between the story of Eos and Kephalos and the story of Ravana and Sita. And the comparison will span both the scenes on the painted hydriae as well as the sculptures from Salinas. So the first point is that Ravana grabs Sita to prevent her escape in the Caeretan hydria, and Eos does the same with Kephalos on the altar's carved sculpture at Salinas. And the next point is that Sita flees in the opposite direction while still facing Ravana in fear. Kephalos turns away to flee from Eos while still looking back at her in the limestone metope as well. So you can see the similarities already in those 2 points. And then both scenes are sexual conquests through forced abduction, and they date from the same time period as well. Late 6th century BC to early 5th century, so circa 530 to 470 BCE. So they're roughly from the same time period as well. And another point is that it is illogical to claim that one is a mythological scene with characters that can be explicitly named, and the other is somehow just some generic scene with no personalized figures. And that's what they seem to conclude for the Caeretan hydria, which makes no sense at all for the Boston hydria, the Caeretan hydria number 2, that is. So, yeah, they're able to positively identify the scene of Eos and Kephalos, or at least they have, they make a conjecture about it, or they have a strong belief that it might be. But with the other scene from Boston, they just simply want to stick to the belief that it's generic somehow, and when that just does not make any sense. And lastly, both events occur when the victim or the victim's husband is out hunting, quote unquote, as if to metaphorically tell us that the hunter has now become the hunted. Remember that the youthful lady Sita implores her husband Rama to hunt the golden deer in the Valmiki Ramayana, but instead Ravana hunts her down. Similarly, Kephalos is said to have been chased down by Eos when he was hunting outside. So, and you can see the source Apollodorus 1.9.4. You can also look at the story of Atlanta for another similar theme of the hunter becoming the hunted. So this really, systematically proves that these 2 stories are very, very similar, and therefore are very, useful for our analysis here. Now, what we have here on the right side is a full-size view of the front side of the Caeretan hydria in Boston, where we see the deer hunt by the 2 nude youths. And what my topic here on this slide will be is a discussion about the mythological content either being vague or not so vague, and some Italian author like Raffaella Bonato think it is vague and uncertain, and they admit that they don't really know what it is. But Jaap Hemmelrich seems to disagree. So he seems to believe that the number 2 and the number 3 hydriae belong to the same group, and he calls that Group A, and that all scenes in this group can be identified with certainty. But the problem is, if vases in Group A contain scenes that are not vague, why has the author not identified the mythological content in the hydria depicting the Ramayanic scene, And, maybe he does really believe with certainty, quote unquote, that it is merely a scene of satyrs chasing Maenads and young men hunting deer. But that would make number 2 an extreme outlier among the vases in that group, almost all of which depict one or more Greek mythological characters, such as Heracles, Atlanta, Hephaestus, Europa, Hermes, Apollo, Artemis. You get the idea, etc. But the reality is that the truth is that it really is an outlier, but only in the sense that it depicts Indian mythological characters, and not in the fact that it's somehow not even mythological at all. That is not the reason why it's an outlier. So I would like to talk about Hemmelrich's questionable conclusions, especially in the area of finding a metaphorical relationship between the obverse and reverse sides of the two Caeretan hydriae, number 3 and number 2. He struggles to explain where the metaphorical relationship is occurring, and really, frankly, I think he just doesn't quite understand it. So the first point is that one could argue that Ravan's abduction of Sita and Eos's abduction of Kephalos could have been depicted on the obverse and reverse sides of a Caeretan hydria, just for the sake of argument, as a metaphorical comparison by the artists of Indian and Greek stories. Now, of course, the author does not think of this hypothetical choice. He says, "I confess that I find it hard to imagine a satisfactory obverse scene portraying the pair of Eos and Kephalos of number 3b, that is the reverse side of number 3b, of number 3 hydria." So the next point is that I personally believe that the obverse scene on the number 3 hydria, where Hermes steals the cattle of Apollo, is connected analogically to the reverse scene of Eos and Kephalos. They both represent, on both sides, they represent the divine mischief of the gods in kidnapping or abducting valuable entities, animals such as cows or even human beings, for self-serving reasons. But unfortunately, the author does not agree with my point of view and starts critiquing the painters themselves and gives us his own opinion on what they should have done. And he writes that the bad composition of the main scene proves that it should have occupied both sides of a vase. The herd of cattle in the forest with hair clearly belong to a reverse scene. The discussion over the sleeping Hermes should occupy the entire obverse frieze. This explanation of the unusual composition also makes it superfluous to look for a connection between A and B on the number 3 hydria. So he's basically just writing off any possible metaphorical connection at all between the two sides of the number 3 hydria, and he's instead looking for a more connected narrative between the cattle being stolen and the sleeping Hermes in the cradle on the other side. So I will give you my main conclusion here on both scenes, the cradle of Hermes in the number 3 hydria, as well as the golden deer episode of Rama and Sita on the number 2 hydria. In my opinion, both hydriae cleverly depict a metaphorical relationship between two mythological scenes on the obverse and reverse sides. Now, Jaap Hemmelrich believes the cattle being stolen in the forest should be on one side of number 3, and the sleeping Hermes with the other characters should be on the other side to create a connected narrative. And he's onto something there, because not only the number 2 hydria has a metaphorical relationship between the two sides A and B, but they also form a connected narrative. And so the stealing of the stranded Sita, like a cow or female mammal, by Ravana on one side, and the unaware youths, Rama and Lakshman, husband and brother-in-law of Sita respectively, hunting the golden deer for her on the other side, you can definitely see not only a metaphorical relationship between the hunted Sita and the hunted golden deer, but you can also see, obviously, the connected narrative from the golden deer episode of the Valmiki Ramayana. Now, when it comes to comparing to the number 3 hydria, you can sort of see that the unaware youths, Rama and Lakshman, are a bit like the clueless Apollo, who is questioning the mother Maya of Hermes about whether, what happened to his cattle. Where did they disappear? So it's like in both number 3 and number 2, Apollo and Rama, the biggest hero, is tricked and deceived, illustrating that even the greatest men or gods or god men or god heroes can be fooled by a cunning scheme. So just to summarize and reiterate, the stranded Sita is a lot like the stolen cattle of Hermes, and the unaware youths Rama and Lakshman are very similar to the frustrated Apollo, who is questioning what happened to his cattle, just like Rama and Lakshman face the disappearance of Sita after they hunt the deer and get frustrated in trying to hunt it down. But the distinction between the number 2 and number 3 hydria is also in the fact that one has a connected narrative and then the other doesn't. The metaphorical relationship is there in both, between the two sides and between the two hydria themselves, as I just showed you. But when it comes to a connected narrative, only the number 2 hydria is able to also form a connected narrative, and that's why it kind of eluded, I think, Hemmelrich's notice, as well as his lack of knowledge of Indian myth. Finally, I would like to share some observations of the German scholar Konrad Schauenberg regarding the Caeretan hydria in Boston. He remarks and observes that the vertical handle of most Caeretan hydriae has 4 ribs. Only the Vienna Bucyrus hydria and the New York hydria have 6-ribbed rear handles. The handle of the Boston hydria, though, is 3-ribbed. He also adds, unusual are the large black dots at the bases of the vertical handle and the limitation of the palmette below that to 5 leaves. In addition, the fact that the palmettes and lotus blossoms in the frieze below the figures, below the 2 maenads and satyrs, that is, each have only 3 leaves, and this is also unusual. So what do we make of these observations here, which are very specific to this Boston hydria? Well, the feature of 3 leaves at the bottom with the lotus blossoms and the palmettes alternating is possibly a feature that is meant to indicate the 3 major events happening in a sequence on the water jar, which we discussed earlier. They are, they start from the deer hunting diversion on the front side and then next to the assault, abduction, or capture of the lady on the reverse side, and then finally the act of fleeing or running away with the kidnapped woman from the area. The satyr Ravana leaves with big strides like a galloping horse to signify that he is taking his victim far away very quickly, while the 2 young men are occupied with the deer. Schauenberg also seems to realize that there are 2 large black dots at the top handle's base, which act as a kind of reflective mirror, or symmetrical motif, that divides the 2 main events of abduction and carrying off of the maenaid, quote-unquote, Sita on the back side. In my opinion, the 2 black dots symbolize not only the 2-part nature of the scene, but the 2-faced nature of Ravana, more animal-like on the left than on the right. So just to summarize, the 3-ribbed handle at the top, as well as the 3-leaf lotus blossoms and palmettes that are alternating in a row in the bottom frieze, are all an indication, they're all pointing to the 3-part nature of the story that's being told on the hydria. Another interesting thing that he notices is the limitation of the palmette in the middle to 5 leaves. And if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that on the left scene, Ravana the satyr, his biceps is overlapping with one of the leaves of the palmette, and this may explain why it was limited to 5, because the artist may have underestimated how much space he needed in order to enlarge the form of Ravana and depict him carrying Sita off in the left side. So again, just to reiterate, if you look very closely at the 5 palmette leaves, you'll see the leftmost is covered slightly by Ravana's left arm. And I think this was probably an accident, a mistake by the painter of underestimating, how much room he really needed in order to depict his enlarged form, and just simply to depict him carrying Sita off, just to depict the whole scene of the taking her away to wherever he was going to take her away, which is probably Lanka. The two-part nature of the scene, which is symbolized by the 2 black dots, also reminds us about the shift from the static to dynamic movement from the right scene to the left scene. And this shift reflects the change in the circumstances from lady trying to exert her freedom and maintain independence to a subdued woman who has all but surrendered to the monstrous Rakshasa.